Before I talk about my setting, I think I'm going to do a quick video where I talk about my own personal Appendix N. The Appendix N, of course, is the very famous appendix at the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide in the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And it is where Gary Gygax made a list of works that informed D&D. Now, there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Appendix N. I think a lot of people think it's just a list of good fantasy that Gary Gygax liked that he suggested you go read. It's actually not the case. Everything that was on the Appendix N contributed something specifically to D&D. Which is exactly why you see things like, why was Clark Ashton Smith left off when he was clearly one of three Musketeers of the Weird Tales? The other two made it, he didn't. It didn't quite make sense. Or Ursula Le Guin, who was, a pretty big-time fantasy writer at a time when there weren't very many big-time fantasy writers yet in print, and it seems kind of odd that she was missed. Well, the reason those two weren't put on there is because nothing was taken deliberately and specifically from their works and added to D&D. I don't know that it meant that Gary Gygax didn't really like Ursula Le Guin or not. Maybe he didn't. I find it a little bit more difficult to imagine he didn't like Clark Ashton Smith, but I don't know, maybe he didn't. But I think that the real thing there is that he made a list of what specifically contributed to D&D. So I'm kind of going to do the same. My list is going to be shorter, and it's going to be annotated. I'm going to talk about it rather than simply list it. But I'm going to talk about the kind of stuff that informs my setting specifically. And it can't be comprehensive because, you get influenced by all kinds of things through your life, and I'm 49 years old, so I've had plenty of experiences that have informed what I want my game setting to be like. But, I'll do my best. This is, like I said, not 100%, but this is the majority of my influences, I would think. First one I'm going to say, and this is not in any particular order, other than maybe the order that I think of it, and the order I think of it probably is related to how much it influenced my setting, or my notion of what a fantasy setting that I really love would be like. First one is Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, this may sound a little bit odd. I have deliberately not made a very Tolkien-esque setting, but that's not because I don't love Tolkien. It's because, to be honest with you, I think as I have read an awful lot of what is sometimes called extruded fantasy product, Tolkien pastiche, if you will, I have found that I think that being too similar in superficial respects to Tolkien just invites comparison that is not going to be flattering. So I recommend not doing it, to be honest with you. But that said, Tolkien did a lot of things extremely well, and it's really hard to get out from under his shadow in the fantasy genre. And even where I'm deliberately trying not to be overtly Tolkien influenced, the very fact that I'm specifically trying not to be is, in fact, a reaction to his place in the genre. And again, I'm not doing this because I think I really love what Tolkien did. I just don't think that I'm capable of doing it in a way that doesn't look like bad pastiche. So I'd rather not. But there's a lot of things that are maybe a little more subtle that he does that I really like. One of the obvious ones is because I kind of started the series out talking about my map making. My maps were heavily, and always have been heavily influenced by the maps that were included with Lord of the Rings, for example. His dedication to creating the verisimilitude in his setting was really kind of second to none. And of course, he obviously had a lifetime to do that. He started this work when he was, a teenager, or at least in his 20s, and published it when he was in middle age, and still kind of was tinkering with it when he died. The Lord of the Rings and its associated works was kind of the work of his lifetime. Very few writers, game masters, or anybody else who does anything at all creative in the fantasy genre can aspire to do that. Very few have the opportunity to. Anyway, yeah, I certainly recommend anybody who has not done so read Tolkien. Read The Lord of the Rings at least, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Or maybe better yet, get them on audiobook. The audiobooks are really quite good. I can't remember the name of the guy who narrates them, but I've been really impressed with them. And the last couple of times that I've quote-unquote read The Lord of the Rings, I've actually listened to them on audiobook. And I've read it, somewhere between 15 and 20 times in my lifetime. Started when I was in junior junior high, and I haven't read it. I'm actually probably overdue to do it again. Second, Edgar Rice Burroughs. My favorite Burroughs stories are actually the John Carter ones, but his probably more famous ones are Tarzan, and pretty much everything that he dabbled in has been influential on me in some ways. Tarzan is not really what a lot of people think it is, who have only are only familiar with pastiches of Tarzan or movies or something like that. They're really quite exotic. They kind of border on a sword and sandal weird tale in a lot of ways. And there's all kinds of bizarre things and lost kingdoms of Romans. He goes to the center of the earth one time. He fights, tiny ant men that are a foot tall. It's just all kinds of, he fights dinosaurs. He does all kinds of weird stuff. And some of them are much more exotic than just even the most exotic African adventure tale that you could imagine. But like I said, John Carter is really my favorite. The Barsoom stuff. I really like the Pellucidar stuff. Some of his one-offs and smaller series I like just as well too. In fact, I would think The Mad King might be one of my favorite of his works. His inventive imaginations, lost civilizations, his bizarre otherworldly wildernesses, his larger-than-life heroes and villains, monsters, damsels in distress. There's literally nothing to like except perhaps one thing, and Burroughs himself was quick to admit it. He really only had one story to tell, and every story kind of has more or less the same basic plot that he tells over and over again. Still, it's easy to forgive him this because his inventive imagination kind of means the plot's not too much of a problem, and besides, it's actually a great plot when it's done well. Some of his characters have more chemistry than others, but when he's really on point, one of the things that Edgar Rice Burroughs does best, which a lot of his imitators failed to do, is he shows us incredible women, princesses, the daughters of 10,000 Jedaks, for example. These women are worthy of being the love interest. And then what he does is he also has heroes that are worthy of these princesses. I mean, these are really superlative people, and it's not surprising, maybe, that when Superman was created, for example, his ability to leap over a tall building in a single bound, he actually pointed specifically to John Carter of Mars and said that was a major inspiration. Not just in the superheroic abilities, but also kind of in the character of the characters. If you haven't read Edgar Rice Burroughs, I highly, highly recommend it. I would read the first 2 Tarzan books and the first 3 Barsoom books, and then go on from there. If you're still interested, there's lots more to explore. Next, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan. It's not too hard to get complete collections of all the Conan stories. He's also got some other great stories too. Solomon Kane, Cole the Conqueror. He's got a pretty decent collection of Lovecraftian horror. He had a series of boxing stories. He wrote all kinds of stuff. Conan, of course, is his most famous creation, and probably most of the best stories are there. Conan, in some ways, is an interesting analog to Tarzan. The 2 characters have a lot in common, but the approach of the author and kind of the feel of the setting is very different, whereas Tarzan, tends to operate in the modern world, although he hangs out in the boonies and in these weird exotic places in the modern world. He's much more of a noble character in a lot of ways, and there's the contrast between the savagery and the nobleness of his character is done very differently than Conan, who Conan is very much a more picaresque character, if you will. And there is some nobility to him. He is an honorable character in many ways, but he's also a darker and harder person than Tarzan in many ways. Again, if you are a fantasy fan and haven't read Conan, what are you waiting for? You should have done it a long time ago. Like I said, I think most of his Conan stories are in the public domain. You could probably get them as a free PDF, text file, Kindle file. If you want to get the trade paperbacks by Del Rey, they're excellent. I highly recommend them. I have all of them. In fact, I've got not only the 3 Conan stories, I've also got the Cole collection and the Solomon King collection, and I think you should get them all. They're all great. Next, Howard Phillips, Lovecraft. I sometimes like to dig at Lovecraft for his poorly crafted stories, his almost cartoonish, stylish affectations, but nobody can deny that his amazing imagination and the concepts that he came up with have been hugely influential in both fantasy and horror. and most likely will be for a long time yet to come. In fact, they're so ubiquitous that they've almost become more of an in-joke than something that's meant to be horrifying. And that's, to be fair, a lot of his stuff wasn't really all that horrifying to begin with. It was so vague and kind of silly that it was imaginative and it was interesting, but I rarely felt like, oh my gosh, this is so horrible. But I felt like my imagination expanded reading Lovecraft in many ways. Sometimes reading some of his magnum opus works like At the Mountains of Madness, you feel like there's a story struggling to get out that he just can't quite tell, but it's just under the surface, and it just, your imagination just blows up with the possibilities, and although he kind of isn't quite capable of realizing all of them, at the same time you can feel them just under the surface, and I kind of feel like that a lot when I read Lovecraft. Some of the things that I have taken from Lovecraft specifically is my approach to monsters. Not that I make them, weird tentacle-y things, although sometimes I do, but rather the fact that a monster shouldn't be some kind of routine thing that a character comes across on his morning commute. It should be a major set piece, maybe even almost the focus of an entire module's worth of adventure in and of itself. And there's an awful lot of techniques from Lovecraft and from horror in general as a genre that you can use to make monsters much more frightening, much more monstrous. In D&D, they have an unfortunate tendency to sometimes become kind of routine and boring. So that's one of the things that I love about Lovecraft. Another thing I love is the idea of the secret history of the world. Now, it's easy to do a secret history of the real world in your story because everybody knows what the real history is. It's a little bit more difficult to kind of do that in a fantasy world where you have to tell them what the regular mainstream story is, and then establish that, and then somehow gradually undermine it and say, oh no, it's wrong. There's actually a secret history that is different, and it's, whatever. That's difficult to do in secondary world, and it takes quite a long time to pull off, so I don't necessarily recommend trying to, especially in a game, unless you're running it as a long-running game. But if you can do it, it's really fun. Another thing, obviously, is that Lovecraft was hugely influential on my notion of magic. And magic in my setting is not Vancian, which would be a D&D standard, but rather Lovecraftian. And it, has the same kind of pulpish pedigree as Jack Vance, but it's very different in tone. Let's see, George Lucas, specifically the Star Wars movies, and the first three at least, and the first few Indiana Jones movies, maybe actually just the first one, were pretty influential on how I perceive good pulpish storytelling. This is a little bit ironic. As the years have gone by, Star Wars and Indiana Jones have lost much of their luster to me. Even looking back on the original trilogy, I kind of start to see things that I didn't for a long time. And some of this stuff I even saw as a kid, it kind of created cognitive dissonance in me. Like the notion that Luke thought he was winning against the Emperor by refusing to fight. Even as a little kid, I was like, what? That's the dumbest thing ever. The whole notion of the Jedi are supposed to be these paragons of virtue, and yet they're, kind of lying, manipulative weasels who try to screw Luke around and tell him all kinds of stuff that isn't true. And even Luke himself, who's supposed to be this everyman hero, really is kind of this beta sad sack loser who's, ogling this little tiny image of Princess Leia. He gets friend-zoned early on. And then to make things even worse, or maybe it was Lucas trying to make things better in some ways, he decided, oh, well, actually it's because she was your sister all along, see? Although it's clear that he made that up in the second or third draft of Return of the Jedi. It actually wasn't a thing before then. And in fact, if you watch the first Star Wars and then read Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was deliberately devised by Lucas and Alan Dean Foster to be a potential low-budget sequel to Star Wars, because Lucas was pessimistic and didn't think it would be successful enough to merit a high-budget sequel. So Splinter in the Mind's Eye was maybe the original vision of a sequel for Star Wars. And in that one, Han Solo barely gets a minor reference. He doesn't make any appearance at all, and Luke and Leia are kind of flirting with each other the entire time. It's clear that Luke and Leia were, in fact, you You can also see it in some of the early drafts of Star Wars. The romantic tension was supposed to be between them, and she was clearly meant to be his love interest. But unfortunately, Lucas wrote Luke as such a kind of pathetic, little beta that it didn't make any sense to continue with it. So she shuffled him off to Han Solo, who was a much more alpha male type character, and it was much more believable that Princess Leia would like him. As an aside, Princess Leia does not compare to Deja Thoris at all. The daughter of 10,000 Jedeks versus the adopted senator who they call princess but isn't really one. Lucas either didn't get the distinction or didn't even try to actually make amazing space princesses and male characters who are worthy to be their love interests, and it's a little disappointing that he didn't. But that's in retrospect. For a long time I loved Star Wars even through its flaws. It's just unfortunately because the franchise has become so hideous in recent years that it's actually made me question even the earlier entries in it, and I now see their flaws much more clearly. I don't think I'll ever stop liking the original trilogy or the first Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it is hugely influential in how I put together my settings and what kind of stuff I put into them, but I don't think Lucas is as good as I used to think he was, unfortunately. Fritz Lieber, next. The Fawford and the Grey Mouser stories. Unfortunately, these kind of peter off after a while, and they're not nearly as good, but there's some really good stories in the first few collections, and I highly recommend that you read them. Now, Fritz Lieber's purpose, that he said, at least his stated purpose, was to create characters that were similar to Tarzan or Conan, but closer to, in his opinion, to true human nature. One of the things that I think is really interesting about Fawford and the Grey Mouser is one of the first instances of kind of the buddy team-up in fantasy, which is just a great vibe. And there were, buddy comedies, buddy dramas, buddy action movies. Everybody's kind of familiar with the whole buddy cop genre, or buddy, they don't have to be cops, I guess. But these are kind of the original fantasy versions of them. And it kind of gives them an awful lot of charm, and they have a lot of chemistry between them. One of my favorite experiences as a dungeon master, or game master, although this specifically was D&D, was that I had a group, and there were 2 players in it who created characters who kind of became a buddy comedy team. And it could have gone badly. It could have been something where, the rest of the group was frustrated that they got so much attention, and I tried really hard to make sure they didn't get too much of it, and they were good. They didn't try to hog the spotlight. But the reality is they were so entertaining that everybody in the group, including the other characters, kind of deliberately stepped back and let them take the lead. And there was one character, he was a hobgoblin rogue, or maybe a rogue fighter combo, I can't remember, it's the 3rd edition. And his ambition, by hook or by crook, was to get an airship and become a pirate. And that was his number one ambition, and of course it never came to pass. Part of the reason that it never came to pass is that because his partner, who was the other character here, was a human swashbuckler, who was a notorious womanizer. And these 2 guys had been through all kinds of stuff together. In fact, they even established that they had this backstory before the campaign even started. They had kind of been partners. The funny thing, of course, is that they sabotaged unwittingly, they sabotaged each other's goals all the time. And yet, they couldn't imagine life without each other. And it was one of the best role-playing experiences I had running that campaign, because they were just so entertaining to watch. So, Fawford and the Grey Mouser, if you can pull that kind of thing off, more power to you. I've only really been able to do it once or twice. If you're looking at kind of more of a fiction rather than gaming expression of your creative side, then it's you could certainly do worse than to emulate the buddy team-up type vibe. Every good story, every good science fiction, every good fantasy story, it's not about the setting, it's not about the plot, it's really about the characters. And so if you can come up, that doesn't mean that those other things don't contribute in a significant way to the success of the story, especially in those genres, but it's really about the characters. And if you can have characters that are fun to read about or to watch or even to role play, and they have good chemistry with each other and bounce off each other, then that's 90% of the success right there. It almost doesn't matter what else you do. Let's see, what else? I really like and am heavily informed in my gaming by thrillers. Even though I don't necessarily read a lot of thrillers, I'm going to suggest Robert Ludlum here, who's an author. I'm going to suggest specifically 3 of his novels: The Holcroft Covenant, Monterey's Circle, and The Bourne Identity. And I think all 3 of those were written in the 70s. But they're just excellent thrillers. And I'm a little bit surprised sometimes that when I hang out in online forums, and I don't do a lot of this anymore because it's a little cringy after a while to talk to some of these people, but there are a lot of people who would say that they only read fantasy. I've even heard people who said they've only ever read D&D fiction, and I think that's just really unfortunate, because I think that in order to be good at your craft, if you aspire to be a dungeon master, if you aspire even to just be a good player in somebody else's game, if you aspire to be a writer, you've got to be familiar with how lots of different things are done well and why they work. And I think that D&D GMs, dungeon masters, could learn an awful lot on how to create better games by being familiar with thrillers. If you struggle to get these 3 books, then I would also, that's obviously easy to find good thrillers that are movies. I recommend the 4 Daniel Craig James Bonds. I know there's a 5th one coming out. It looks like it's going to be terrible, I'm afraid. It looks like they've kind of completely lost the plot on what makes James Bond such a beloved character. But, whatever. I recommend the 4 that have already come out. I recommend the 3 most recent Mission Impossible movies. And I recommend the first 3 Jason Bourne movies, if you want to get them in a visual format rather than a novel format. But I also recommend that you look at those 3 novels. But either way, I strongly suggest that you kind of just familiar yourself with how thrillers work. And if you've seen all those movies before, or even if you've read those books before, I urge you to do it again and approach them with the aspect of, okay, I don't want to necessarily just be entertained by this movie or this book. I want to actually kind of examine how it was put together, how it was crafted. And I think you'll find that there's some really interesting things you can learn about how to run your game better there. Let's see, next, Lee Brackett, who's most famous in our little slice of genre fandom for having been a sword sorcery, more of a space opera writer, and she wrote like the Eric John Stark books, for example. Strongly recommend and it usually comes bundled together. It's People of the Talisman and the Secret of Sinharat. It's kind of a double book that takes place on Mars with Eric John Stark. But she did a lot of other things besides that, and she was actually a master of her craft in other arenas entirely. And she wrote some extremely well-regarded and highly praised screenplays, for example, for movies that are extremely well loved. And obviously everybody's going to say, oh, well, you mean like Empire Strikes Back? Well, yes, that's one. But she also wrote The Big Sleep, which is one of the most famous noir movies ever written. She wrote westerns like Rio Bravo and El Dorado, which are, most people would consider them up near the top of the western genre. My personal favorite of hers is actually Hatari, which was a Howard Hawks movie that came out in 1962. It stars John Wayne, but it's kind of an ensemble cast thing. There's a lot of other people in it: Elsa Martinelli, Hardy Kruger, Bruce Cabot. It's just a fascinating and fantastic movie. It's one of my favorite old movies of all time. And the premise of it is that there's this group of incredibly masculine, manly guys who live on this kind of ranch house out in Africa. And their job includes hopping in beat up old trucks and army surplus jeeps and chasing down wild animals on the Serengeti or the Ngorongoro crater or other, kind of the savannas of Africa, lasso them up, throw them in cages, and ship them off to zoos and circuses who have pay them for their animals to put in the zoos or to use in the circuses. And it's kind of interesting, although that premise is itself extremely exciting in its own right, it really kind of slips into the background. And, there's scenes where they're riding around chasing animals and John Wayne's sitting buckled into this chair on the front end of a pickup truck, lassoing zebras and stuff. But it does kind of fade into the background. And what the movie really kind of becomes about is that there's these 2 girls that kind of stumble into their world, and it's like a rom-com for guys, where instead of being sappy and feminine, it's like masculine and cool, and these girls just don't, they're sexiness just does not quit. Elsa Martinelli is so feminine, so, I don't know, just the pleasantness that she kind of exudes, even though it's sometimes kind of frustrating. It's kind of a fond frustrating. It's, you know, women have forgotten more about being feminine than Elsa Martinelli did by instinct in 1962. And it's just an incredibly charming movie to watch. And it's funny because there's actually not a lot of plot, and sometimes it just kind of ambles along between these kind of character building vignettes that don't accomplish a whole lot other than these characters have so much chemistry and they're so charismatic that you don't care that there's no plot moving forward sometimes. And then of course stuff happens, and it's a funny movie, but there's just an awful lot that Lee Brackett did that is worth emulating. And I've found even the idea of chasing after these wild animals, that's been hugely influential in my gaming, that I say, you know, some of these wild animals, who needs monsters when you've got animals this dangerous? You're kind of missing an opportunity. Plus there's like some actual resonance with the characters because they know something about real animals. And if you kind of show them something that's related or similar to a real animal but even more dangerous, they understand that in a way that they don't understand a monster, which is kind of more theoretical. Anyway, Lee Brackett's husband, Edmund Hamilton, who was a famous space opera writer himself, once said of Lee Brackett's stories that they are often a strong man's quest for a dream and of his final failure when it turns to smoke and ashes in her hands. Her heroes seek something that they can never quite attain, yet their failure is not really defeat. That does not apply to Hatari, by the way, but it does apply to like the Eric John Stark stories and a lot of the books that she wrote. Highly recommend Lee Brackett, and you will not be sorry that you checked her out. The last one that I'm going to list here is Sergio Leone. Now, I'm a fan of Westerns. I'm really kind of more a fan of real Westerns, though. I'm not much of a fan of the revisionist Western. The spaghetti Westerns are sometimes lumped with revisionist Westerns because they came out kind of at the same time, and the revisionist Westerns in some ways piggybacked off of what the spaghetti Westerns were doing. But they weren't really the same thing. The revisionist Westerns were written by Americans kind of deconstructing and rejecting their own background and heritage, whereas the spaghetti Westerns were written by people who had no direct attachment to the idea of the Western, and so they kind of just reflected their own society's values on it. And Sergio Leone was kind of a, you know, he was an Italian guy who had been through World War II, he had been through the fascist government, he had been through the disaster that kind of was the post-fascist government, and he was kind of a cynical guy who grew up in southern Italy, which is famous for its corruption and organized crime, and he kind of brought that attitude and that vibe to the Western. And you know, the Dollar Trilogy, which I think is the ones that I really, you know, like. I don't like his other stuff quite as much. There's a lot of interesting analogs to how D&D should be played, I think, to be found there. You know, the idea that the setting is kind of a hardscrabble frontier with morally ambiguous characters where the settlers live a precarious life. There's hostile savages just beyond their borders. There's a definite need of some kind of rough men who maybe aren't necessarily heroes, but they're adventurous and they're, you know, violent men of action. And they go out there and try to defend the settlements, the homesteads, and maybe get some sweet loot while they're at it in the process. And there's a lot about Westerns, especially maybe in some ways the spaghetti Western, that works really, really well in D&D. And not only that, I just personally am a huge fan of the American West. I grew up in Texas. My mother was from, actually both of my parents had lived when they were younger in the Rocky Mountain West, although my dad was kind of an ethnic Southerner from many, many generations back, all the way back to the colonies. I've always had this love for the West, especially the mountains and especially the deserts, and I have a hard time not incorporating that into my settings as well. I'm a huge fan of the wilderness even now. Hiking is one of my other hobbies, even though I'm kind of getting a little older and out of shape to do stuff I'd really like to do. I still get out there and just soak in the ambiance of being away from people and in these beautiful natural settings as much as I can. And if I could, I'd go 3 or 4 times a week out, or a week, I wish. I'd go 3 or 4 times a year out to the Rockies or the Southwest and, spend a week hiking. I unfortunately can't afford to do that. I just don't have the time to spare to take that much vacation doing something just for me. My family would be like, what the heck? I bring a lot of that to my settings. It informs my settings. And a lot of that can be obtained vicariously from the Western. A lot of it can be, and a lot of the other vibes. It's not just, of course, the setting that makes the Western what it is. It's also the type of people who make the classic Western story that are very, very similar, I think, to the type of people that make up the classic D&D story. And this is what I mean sometimes when I say that the Old West is influential on my settings. And I don't mean that to suggest that there are actual cowboys or boomtowns or the kind of things that are very specifically Old West, but just more the idea of people pushing into a frontier wilderness and establishing, the first outposts of civilization, and then the rough men who kind of are not only helping protect those outposts of civilization to thrive, but also pushing even further and finding out what's beyond, just the next step beyond. And I think that's a huge part of what makes D&D successful, and it's basically also the story of the Old West. So even though, superficially it doesn't look the same, I think the Westerns make a very good analog for what D&D should be like. And I specifically recommend that you look at older, true Westerns, not revisionist Westerns. Otherwise, you'll end up with something that probably doesn't tell the story you want to tell. And as just an aside, there's an interesting anecdote that after Clint Eastwood came back from doing the spaghetti westerns, he directed a couple westerns of his own, like Pale Rider and High Plains Drifter. And, he had become a legitimate star in his own right, not only as a Western movie star, but also as a director. And apparently he wrote to John Wayne, who was still alive, although getting a little bit older at this time in the early 70s, and suggested that they collaborate on something. And John Wayne apparently wrote back to him a kind of an angry letter. And was like, no, I have no interest in working with you. You've deconstructed and destroyed the Western, and is the antithesis of everything that the Westerns I made stand for, and I don't want to have any part of it. And that was the end of that. They never worked together, which is a little bit unfortunate. Those are the two biggest names most people think of when they think of Westerns, John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, but they had very different approaches. And although I'm specifically recommending Sergio Leone, I otherwise kind of suggest that maybe if you're looking for Western influence, you don't look at the rest of Clint Eastwood's work. And you may want to watch it for other reasons. It's not without merit, but it's not really a true Western. It's also a revisionist Western or an anti-Western. It's kind of the opposite of a Western that just superficially takes place in a Western setting. For that matter, you can say the same thing about some of the sword and sorcery that was coming out in the 60s. This stuff like what L. Sprague de Camp or Michael Moorcock wrote, although a lot of people say that it's sword and sorcery. I say it's not. It's anti-sword and sorcery. It's deliberately the opposite of sword and sorcery. It has the same superficial trappings, but what it's trying to do is literally the opposite. It's trying to tear down the entire trope basket, if you will, that sword and sorcery is built on, and replace it with something that literally means the exact opposite. So it can't possibly be sword and sorcery. It's anti-sword and sorcery. It's meant to destroy sword and sorcery. Same thing with the revisionist Western. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit rambly, and this is turning into quite a long recording, so I think I will quit while I'm ahead, and I'll start talking more specifically about my setting next time.